So, as I mentioned on the most recent Weekly Sip, a local Antifa blog has decided to run a hit piece on me. They put my personal info out there, which is fine because I had already put it out there years ago, and they threw a whole bunch of unfounded accusations at me. But when it came down to the actual critiques of my content, well, they didn't actually critique it. Here are some of Devin's most recent videos. As you'll see just from the titles, they are terrible. It's just my videos. Yep. I stand by all of these, you know? This video here it's not even mine, like it's somebody replying to me. I don't know how this got in the mix. Imagine posting consumerism to this article as if it were some kind of an own. This is one of his latest videos, positive nationalism. They just complained that I guess I talk about positive nationalism. Here's where they lay out some quotes. All quotes that I stand by the way. If this sounds like typical anti-Muslim and white supremacist rhetoric, that's because it is. You know, I thought Muslim was a religion and white people could also be Muslim. I don't know if this makes sense, dude. And of course, SFO says explicitly that he's a liberal. Who cares? It's completely possible for him to have centrist or leftist views and still be xenophobic and Islamophobic. So I guess your political persuasion doesn't actually matter as long as you just follow their ideology, maybe? I don't know. He also claims to be friends with prominent Gamergate personality Carl Benjamin, Sargon of Akkad. This whole sentence kind of reminds me, when I got booted out of that Vampire the Masquerade official Discord, one of the things that I couldn't get a screenshot of because I was kicked out before I could screenshot it, was they called me Sargon Adjacent. I wonder if being called Sargon Adjacent is going to be one of the new things. But in any case, they don't actually refute any of this stuff. They just bring up me talking about it as if just simply speaking about Islamic immigration into Canada is itself a crime. Even mentioning that it is a thing happening, or that it might be bad, that itself is evidence that I'm some kind of white supremacist Nazi bigot or something. I don't know, dude. Do you think I'm a bigot for bringing up, for example, the police treating an attack on 2 Thornhill boys as a hate crime? Police in York Region, north of Toronto, are treating an attack on 2 Jewish boys as a hate crime. The boys, who were wearing a kippot, I don't know how you actually pronounce kippot, I don't know, were approached by another youth who began swearing at them from behind. As the 2 boys tried to leave the area, the youth allegedly punched one of them in the face and then followed him and his friend for some distance before fleeing the scene. Saturday's attack comes on the heels of 2 anti-Semitic incidents in Montreal, including one in which a taxi driver was caught on camera allegedly beating a Jewish passerby. Well, if he was caught on camera, it's probably a bit more than allegedly, isn't it? The taxi driver was later fired, and Montreal police are investigating. In another incident, a Jewish resident of Montreal was subjected to anti-Semitic death threats at a Tim Hortons outlet in the city. While violent attacks against Jews are relatively rare in Canada, overall incidents including violence, vandalism, and harassment increased from 1,752 in 2017 to a new high of 2,041 last year. Of course, this article doesn't bring up the demographics of the person actually committing the attack. Well, maybe I'm an Islamophobe for bringing this one up. Protesters violently disrupt pro-Israel event at Toronto's York University. Mayor and Premier condemn violence after pro-Palestinian demonstrators try to break up an appearance by the IDF reservists at a Canadian school. Look at this guy right here. It's kind of blocked by that YouTube play button, but he looks like your regular old white supremacist, doesn't he? Members of the university chapter of Students Against Israeli Apartheid, or SAIA, tried to shut down a university-approved panel discussion featuring reservists on duty, a group made up of former Israeli soldiers. The protesters, some with their faces concealed by kafia scarves, chanted pro-Palestinian slogans in the auditorium that included calling for an intifada or attacks against Israeli civilians. Further investigation is required into how a registered student group was permitted to glorify terrorism and attempt to intimidate those peacefully assembling on campus. Maybe talking about this one makes me an Islamophobe. York Region Jews, by the way, those of you who aren't Canadian, the York Region is literally just Toronto and its surrounding suburbs. York Region Jews working to combat unprecedented rise in anti-Semitism. Corey Margulies was on medical leave when he received an upsetting phone call. It was May 2017, and he planned to return to work as a teacher at a public school in the Northern York Region in June. The school principal phoned, asking whether he had spoken to the police yet. He had no idea what the principal was talking about. A member of the York Regional Police Hate Crimes Unit called Margulies that day and said the school had received a letter addressed to him. The letter said, "Filthy Jew. If you return to school, you only have yourself to blame for what happens." So in that 1752 and 2041 statistic from the last article, that actually included a whole bunch of things that were happening online. And when you take online abuse out of the equation and leave only violence, real-life harassment, and vandalism, you get 221 incidents in 2016, and then an increase to 360 incidents in 2017, according to Statistics Canada. And in 2018, they also showed that Jewish people were the most frequent victims of hate crimes, at 64.4% of all total hate crimes in Canada, followed by Muslim at 17.8% and Catholic at 13.3%. Well, if I'm not an Islamophobe yet, maybe this article will finally make me one for real. A disturbing new normal. How Jewish Canadians are reacting to spate of anti-Semitic violence. In Canada, similar to the US, the anti-Semitism we see comes from a polarized world. There's hate on the extreme right, and hate on the extreme left. Considering the state of the UK's Labour Party and the US's radical black activists, I am not surprised we're seeing something similar here in Canada. So a rabbi in Ottawa was driving to New York State last weekend when he got a text from his daughter. A machete-wielding man had stabbed 5 people who were celebrating Hanukkah in a home next to a synagogue just around the corner from where she lives. And that's not all. Fireworks were shot at Jews in Quebec, and a group of Orthodox students were assaulted on the streets in Toronto. Of course, we have to be honest here. Not all of these incidents of anti-Semitism that are happening in Canada right now are coming from Islamic immigrants. For example, this article from May 1st, 2019, Hate Crimes Against Jewish Canadians Keep Rising, Anti-Semitism Isn't Just History, does appear to be referring to hate coming from not Islamic immigrants, but legitimate white supremacists. They do talk about 2 Jewish children in Saskatchewan who were assaulted by their schoolmates, and 4 Jewish teenagers attacked in Toronto by a group of youths. And again, they don't mention the nationality of those people who are attacking them. But they also talk about this graffiti, watch yourself, with a swastika. If I had to guess, this would definitely not be Islamic, it would probably be white supremacist in nature. But to say that everything is simply white supremacist, especially if it's coming from, say, a brown Islamic immigrant, just seems to be ridiculous, doesn't it? Like, here's a list of the 12 most anti-Semitic incidents in Canada, at least according to the Canadian Centre of Holocaust Studies. Let me know in the comments which of these you think is Islamic in origin or white supremacist in origin. Rampant anti-Semitism targets Jewish students at York University. I think a previous article talked about this. A Jewish student sitting at a table with a sign that read, "I'm a Zionist, ask me why," was verbally attacked by other students who shouted "Intifada," "Wipe Israel off the map," "Jews control the world," and other anti-Semitic slogans. And then they talk about the fight between the pro-Israel group and the pro-Palestinian group in the second paragraph. McGill University student newspaper and student council's anti-Semitism denounced by the administration. A Jewish student was threatened with removal if she did not cancel a trip to Israel. University of Toronto student groups were found guilty of anti-Semitism. A member of the university's board of directors told a Jewish student that a motion to support kosher food may not be put forward, even though I'm sure the University of Toronto certainly has halal food. The Edmonton Journal published an anti-Semitic cartoon, and here's the cartoon. It kind of looks like something that Ben Garrison would draw. During the annual Walk with Israel, a man was filmed yelling "Heil Hitler" and calling for Jewish people to be killed. Jesus. The Liberal Party, Green Party, and NDP have all expelled candidates for anti-Semitism. Hate-motivated messages were posted in 6 locations throughout Burlington. A Jewish man was a victim of an anti-Semitic assault in Montreal. This was the taxi driver one. And here's the taxi driver. It's kind of hard to tell, isn't it? What do you think? The yearly Al-Quds rally continued in Toronto. Election signs of political candidates and synagogues were vandalized with hate graffiti. This one does seem to be, Jesus Christ, somewhat clear-cut, doesn't it? A sign was vandalized at a rabbi's home and synagogue in the York region, and Canada's federal court rules that wine made in the West Bank can't be labeled as a product of Israel, but I guess maybe a product of Palestine, maybe a product of the West Bank, I'm not sure. Let's be honest here, guys. This list definitely has like a pro-Israel slant. I'm sure not all of these are actually rooted in anti-Semitism. Like, for example, the wine labeling just seems to be a whatever. And the Al-Quds rally in Toronto seems to be Muslims protesting both Zionism and ISIS. So to an outsider, this list definitely seems biased. At the same time, you have to realize that the group Al-Quds, or however you pronounce it, it's the same name used for Iran's Quds Force, as well as Palestine's Al-Quds Brigades, and probably other Muslim groups as well. The reason being, Quds is the Muslim name for Jerusalem. So even as they're against Zionism and ISIS, I'm not sure if you could properly call these people, friends of Western liberalism or anything. But in any case, at least some of these incidents are definitely fueled by increased Islamic immigration to Canada. According to the most recent publication of Canada's National Household Survey, Muslims make up 3% of Canada's total population, with over 1 million people living in Canada identifying as Muslims. Most of them seem to live in either Toronto or Montreal, which is I'm sure just coincidentally, the two locations where most anti-Semitic incidents keep happening. And although 3% is really not that much, it's still the fastest growing religion in Canada. And thankfully, Canada's not in the same situation as the UK is. This is from 2007, so maybe things have changed a bit in the past 13 years. But that also means this is before social justice had a grip on everything. And this is probably relatively accurate, at least at the time. This is an article from the CBC. Canada's Muslims, an international comparison. Compared to their counterparts in the UK, Germany, France, and Spain, Canadian Muslims appear to be the most contented, moderate, and, well, Canadian in the developed world. Canadian Muslims self-report feeling less hostility from the non-Muslims around them as compared to Britain, Germany, France, and Spain. They also feel that in the struggle between moderate Muslims and extremist Muslims, more of them side with the moderates than the extremists. 80% moderate in Canada, with Britain having only 66 and Germany 75. France has us beat, though, with 89, but keep in mind that is 2007, things are probably a bit different there now. So maybe I'm just a big ol' Islamophobe after all. Yes, Canada has had an upswing of anti-Semitic attacks recently, and yes, at least some of them can be attributed to increased Muslim immigration in the past 5 years under Trudeau. But I guess those are just hate facts. Well, I mean, I'm no stranger to hate facts, as I'm sure you probably know. So why don't we talk about a few more? Sharia sets off alarms in Canada. Here's the facts. Okay, tell me the facts about Sharia in Canada, Vancouver son. The North Shore News recently ran a pleasant multicultural story about a new mosque opening in the Norgate neighborhood. But phone lines heated up when readers noticed a line buried at the bottom of the story. That is where the mosque's imam remarked, offhandedly, on how certain decisions involving members would be made according to Muslim law. I mean, the Sharia. The mention of Sharia set off alarm bells for some. They contacted the Vancouver Sun, claiming that the mosque would take away the rights of women, never allow them to divorce, sanction honor killings, and encourage Muslim men to marry 4 wives. After a discussion with the editors, I phoned the mosque's directors. They were taken aback. Although they acknowledged that the imam misspoke, one director was offended, referring to my line of questioning as anti-multicultural and ostracizing. Another director said members would always adhere to the laws of Canada when conducting mosque business, Sharia or not. And another said he advises any Canadian Muslim woman or man seeking a divorce to consult a secular lawyer. I asked some follow-up questions of the all-male directors, but never heard back. Leaders of the British Columbia Muslim Association confirm Muslims in Canada follow the nation's laws, including on issues such as polygamy and the right to divorce. The Sun did not pursue the story. Clearly, Sharia gets Canadians worked up. But should it? Well, I don't know. Should it? I mean, let's talk about what Sharia brings, maybe. The world's Muslims overwhelmingly view certain behaviors, including prostitution, homosexuality, suicide, abortion, euthanasia, and consumption of alcohol, as immoral. The majority of Muslims in many African countries believe polygamy is morally acceptable, as do 37% of Muslims in Pakistan. The findings regarding countries such as Pakistan should be of special interest to Canadians, since Pakistan is Canada's largest source of Muslim immigrants. There are more than 140,000 Pakistan-born Muslims in Canada, and it turns out that Pakistani Muslims are among the most hardline. Support for a woman's right to divorce her husband drops to 26% among Muslims in Pakistan. More than half of Muslims in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Iraq do not reject honor killings for premarital sex. More than 2/3 of Muslims from Pakistan, Jordan, Egypt, Malaysia, and Afghanistan favor the death penalty for those who convert to another religion. However, the Canadian Muslims I've interviewed over the years always make it clear they do not agree with such extremist beliefs. No matter what some Muslims believe in other parts of the world, Canadian Muslims have reassured me they respect this nation's secular laws regarding religious freedom, divorce, sex outside marriage, and women's equality. Let's hope that always remains true. Let's hope. But at the risk of the local Antifa chapter calling me an Islamophobe again, maybe we should see what's actually been going on with Canada's Muslims. Canada struggles as it opens its arms to victims of ISIS. Keep in mind that Trudeau's plan has always been to repatriate ISIS fighters back to Canada. But when it comes to caring for ISIS victims, oh no, Canada has to struggle with that one. Recently, a leader of one of Canada's largest refugee agencies entered an English language classroom in downtown Calgary, just after a 28-year-old woman had finished describing the screams of a young girl being raped by an Islamic State soldier. Suddenly, the woman fell unconscious. Her eyes rolled into the back of their sockets, her back arched on the floor, and she began to hyperventilate, her voice rising an octave until it emerged as a yelp. She grabbed fistfuls of her hair and snapped her teeth at her forearms. "Don't let her bite herself," her interpreter said, settling down to hold one of the woman's arms and stroke her face lovingly. The woman, Jihan, is one of the almost 1,200, mostly women and children, victims of the Islamic State who have been brought to Canada as part of a special refugee program set up particularly for Yazidis. The services have been disparate and not coordinated, said Michelle Rempel, the opposition member of parliament who has championed the Yazidi cause. I don't understand why the government has not put more emphasis on it. When ISIS militants descended onto Yazidi villages, they rounded up the men, either forcing them to convert to Islam or be killed. The women and girls, some as young as 9, were catalogued and sold into a codified system of sex slavery. Jihan was sold so many times she lost count. She and a few other women in Calgary have had seizure-like attacks in which they drop to the ground and seem to relive their rapes. Alright, so things are pretty rough for the Yazidis, but at least Canada's trying to do their best, right? Former ISIS sex slaves sheltered in Canada are threatened with phone calls and texts. 5 women and 1 14-year-old girl have filed reports with the police. The victims are all Yazidis who survived an ISIS-led genocide. In one message, a man laughs as he says in Arabic, "I am the man who fucked you. I am your rapist." A second caller denounces Yazidis as devil worshippers. A third caller makes a graphic reference to rape. The callers appear to have Iraqi, North African, and Gulf state accents. "I saw my ISIS captor and rapist in Canada," says a former Yazidi sex slave. One ISIS survivor said that she saw her captive and rapist here in Canada. Even more heartbreaking was the fact that when she spoke, she hid behind a few signs so her rapist would not come and find her. It says a lot about the hollowness of our allegedly feminist government that a survivor of sexual slavery does not have the confidence in the Canadian government to protect her from ISIS here in Canada. Here's a tweet from Imam Tawhidi, which has since been purged by Twitter, of course, so the video's been lost. But it says, a Yazidi woman ending her tears after crying for nearly 10 minutes in a gathering today in Toronto. She was captured, sold, bought, and raped by ISIS. She fled to Canada and saw her ISIS rapist on a bus in Ontario, Canada. It seems to me that Canada is failing these legitimate refugees in the name of multiculturalism. Because I guess if you believe the absolute worst thing you could be is an Islamophobe, like say that brainlet who wrote that hit piece on me, then these kinds of atrocities are justifiable. It's not just the Yazidis though. In Canada, a 14-year-old girl was sexually assaulted by a Muslim migrant, and her school asks her to consider the situation from his point of view. The incident occurred when 2 Syrian refugees began grinding on the 14-year-old girl. Soon, one of the Syrian boys began groping the girl's breasts, before sticking his hand inside her underwear and touching her vagina. Perhaps the most troubling part of the story occurred after the incident, when documents obtained in a Freedom of Information request revealed school officials standing up for the Syrian boy. The victim's mother was encouraged by the Fredericton City Police to look at the incident from the perspective of the Syrian refugee. This meant considering cultural issues, such as the difference in the way Canadian women dress and the flowing hormones of a boy in a different country. The alleged attacker received 1 week suspension and is back at school. The victim is currently undergoing therapy. A Saudi Arabian teen granted asylum in Canada has to get 24-hour security amid threats. Raf Mohammed Al-Kanun, an 18-year-old, arrived in Toronto on the weekend as a government-sponsored refugee after taking to social media to allege abuse at the hands of her father. She was also fleeing attempts to force her into an arranged marriage. But since she's arrived in Canada, she's been receiving threats. Online, yes, but still from Muslims in Toronto, the same city that she's now living in. A similar thing happened to Asia Bibi. As far as I can understand, Asia Bibi is a human rights activist in Pakistan. She spent nearly a decade on death row over there over false blasphemy allegations. However, she somehow managed to get out and make it to Canada. And here's a video of a new refugee to Canada from Pakistan, declaring his intent to find and kill Asia Bibi.
हिफाजत कनाडा पाकिस्तान से कनाडा मुंतकिल कर दिया गया है और वहाँ उसे एक मंसूबे के तहत एक अवार्ड दिया जाएगा जिसमें उसे कहा जाएगा कि तुम दोबारा गुस्ताखाना अल्फाज कहो उसको उस भयानक उस इक़दाम से रोकने के लिए और उसको भयानक मौत मारने के लिए उसको वासने जहन्नम करने के लिए कल रात से मैं भी कनाडा पहुंच चुका हूं और इंशाअल्लाह अज़्ज़ा वजल बहुत जल्द उस गुस्ताखे रसूल को उसके भयानक अंजाम तक पहुंचा के दम लूंगा.
An Arab language newspaper published in Canada praises jihad massacre at a synagogue as a qualitative attack The Canadian Arabic language newspaper Al Forcan, based in Windsor, Ontario, and distributed in Canada and the United States, described a terrorist attack against a synagogue in Jerusalem as a qualitative attack carried out by two heroes. 6 people were murdered in the attack, and the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine claimed responsibility. Al Forcan also published hadiths that speak about Muslims killing Jews as part of the final Islamic fight to establish Sharia law and justice in the entire world. A 23-year-old man was charged for allegedly lighting incendiary devices at Langara College. A man has been charged in relation to the arson incident, arson is what they're calling it, that forced the evacuation and closure of Langara College on Monday. Vancouver police say 23-year-old Nasruddin Abduzmabad Ali has been charged with 1 count of arson related to inhabited property and 1 count of possession of incendiary material. You know, with a name and charges like that, we may never know the motivation of the attacker. 3 Ottawa men accused of sexually assaulting a teen girl. Of course, I'm sure the men are from Ottawa, right? They're native-born Canadians. Bail Muhammad, Yusuf, Ismail Molim, all from Ottawa, are jointly charged with the following: sexual assault with weapon, sexual assault that causes bodily harm, sexual assault as a party to the offense, sexual interference, invitation to sexual touching, forcible confinement, conspiracy to commit an indictable offense. The ages are 27, 30, and 21, and this was a 15-year-old girl. She had met a man at a local shopping center in East Ottawa. For some reason, she went home with the man, and once she was at his house, she was not allowed to leave. And although I am no great fan of rebel media, they seem to be the only group out there that's actually talking to real Canadian Muslims on the ground to get their opinions on things. Like, hey, how about this? How does this sound? Does this sound like a Toronto you guys want to live in?
What would happen to a gay couple in Gaza?
Executed according to Islamic law. Islam doesn't endorse gayism. Islam doesn't endorse homosexuality.
Okay, so would you like to see Sharia law in Canada replace Canadian law?
At some point it will. You know, because we have families, we are making babies. You're not. Your population is going down the slump, right? Yeah. By 2060, Muslims will be the biggest religious group the world over. Right. What are you going to do then?
Actually,
are you going to oppose Sharia? Even then, you know, there is unfairness. There is racial profiling here.
But see, I think that's the difference between you and I. I don't want any unfairness, even because you're a Muslim. But at the same time, I don't want to see people being executed for their sexual orientation.
Okay, why?
Why would you want that, sir?
No. Why would you not want people like, you know, it's because of these abnormal sexual orientations that your population is going down the slump as we are growing everywhere. And whatever the gay people are doing is against the commandments of God.
We have Canadian law here, and you say that you want Sharia law to displace Canadian law. That doesn't sound very respectful.
In majority, you wouldn't have any other option, my friend. Because we owe our allegiance and our loyalty first and foremost to our religion, not to the Queen.
Okay, maybe it's just a few random nutjobs saying this stuff. Surely it's not the imams preaching this stuff to their Muslim congregations, right?
I want to see Islam every single corner in the city. I would like to see niqabi, hijabi, jilbab everywhere in the city. I would love to see brothers with beard, with kufi, with hat, with thobes everywhere. Because when they see more of us, they will have more respect for us. They will say, look, they are everywhere. They are everywhere. We cannot go against them. When we try to blend in, try to be like them.
And so we see around us that the people are preparing themselves to celebrate Christmas. And with great sadness, we see that amongst us there are those who think it's a small matter. And so, not only might we congratulate them on their Christmas, on their false holiday and celebration, but we may take part in their holiday as well. Do you know that you and I must be offended when people say that they worship Jesus, or when they say that Jesus is the Son of God? Why do our hearts not react? There are those who will say to them, Merry Christmas. What are you congratulating them on? Congratulations on the birth of your Lord? Is that acceptable to a Muslim? Are you now approving of their beliefs? By you saying that, you are approving of it. If a person were to commit every major sin, a zina, التعامل بالربا, الكذب, القتل, murder, committing adultery, dealing with interest. All of these sins, if a person were to do all of those major sins, they are nothing compared to the sin of congratulating and greeting the non-Muslims on their false festivals.
Let me tell you something in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As far as sin is concerned, yeah? The one that sells drugs, good or bad? Just very quickly, good or bad? Bad. How about the murderer? How about the one who commits adultery, zina? What about the one who rapes a child? What about the one who drinks alcohol? What about the one who does the biggest of the kabair, good or bad? This person, one person that commits all of these sins, he commits all of these sins on a daily basis, but he prays is better in the eyes of Allah than the one that doesn't commit any of these sins but doesn't pray. So you and your brother, yeah, I'm a good guy. Habibi, God, pack that up because it's not going to work on the day of judgment. Any person that misses one salah, one, not two, one salah, you miss one salah for no reason, you're worse than a murderer, you're worse than a rapist, you're worse than a terrorist, you're worse than a pedophile in the eyes of Allah.
In 2010, again before social justice and political correctness got its grip on everything in Canadian society, this was published on The Star. One law for all Ontarians. 5 years ago, this would be 2005, Premier Dalton McGuinty announced there will be no Sharia law in Ontario. There will be no religious arbitration in Ontario. There will be one law for all Ontarians. The Premier was referring to the fact that since 1991, arbitration decisions made according to religious laws were enforceable in the Ontario courts, and he was now going to rescind the law that made this possible. McGuinty's declaration ended a heated 20-month controversy sparked by Toronto lawyer Saeed Mumtaz Ali's 2004 announcement that an Islamic Institute of Civil Justice would shortly begin arbitrating family matters on the basis of Sharia law, accompanied by a warning that Muslims who did not submit cases to Islamic arbitration panels were not good Muslims. This was back when Canadian politicians had the balls to actually stand up for their convictions and say no, equal rights. We all have the same rights under the law. We all have the same obligations to that law, and nobody gets to operate differently, legally, simply because of their faith. However, since last year, Sharia has made a comeback in Ontario. McGuinty's promise to us that we would all be equal has been overturned. And it's the naive bougie leftist who says things like, well, it's just their way, man, it's just their culture, you know, why don't you just let them live the way that they want to live? Well, that's a BS answer. I am not interested in sitting by and letting people's human rights be trampled just because they come from a different culture. It doesn't matter if they're brown Islamic women, they are still equal to everyone else. And the fact that the radical left wants them to be held under this barbaric alternate set of laws, simply because they come from a foreign culture, shows them to be the racists that they actually are. In my opinion, if you're in Canada, you have the same rights as everyone. Period. I'm not gonna excuse the abuse of women and the harassment of gays just because it comes from a brown guy. The same university that gave Lindsay Shepherd all that trouble for neutrally playing a Jordan Peterson clip in class created and distributed the Canadian Muslim Voting Guide for 2019's election. Here's their summary of all the major candidates. Justin Trudeau has 3 passes on alt-right groups and Islamophobia, M103, and immigration and refugees. He has 1 needs improvement on religious freedom and dress in Quebec, and he has 2 failures, boycott and divestment sanctions and on foreign policy. In total, Trudeau was given a needs improvement. The only person who was given a full pass was the leader of the NDP. And both Andrew Scheer, the leader of the Conservatives, and Maxime Bernier, the leader of the PPC, got complete fails. Of course. I am sure that Muslims think it's oppressive to stop the spread of Sharia in Canada. As you read the pamphlet, you begin to realize that the whole thing is literally just propaganda that is somewhat pro-Trudeau, very pro-NDP and Green, and very anti-conservative and PPC. And because I guess all of these brainlets are cut from the same cloth, whenever they criticize someone like Maxime Bernier, who dare to publicly talk about the real danger that Islamic extremism actually brings to Canada, towards women, towards LGBT people, they simply call him an Islamophobe. It's just like that idiot who wrote the article on me. They neutrally present these passages as if they're supposed to be indicative of something, but to any sane person, they sound completely reasonable. It's like, oh, here's an example of this extremist far-right Islamophobia. And it's literally just, you know, I don't want gay people to get thrown off rooftops. I don't want there to be Sharia no-go zones in Toronto. I don't want honor crimes or female genital mutilation to be a thing here in Canada. I don't want women to be forced into hijabs or forced to marry somebody they don't want. We are at the point where publicly making any of those statements, even though they are fundamentally pro-women and pro-LGBT, makes you Islamophobic. Looking over the entire situation, Canada is not in as dire straits as, say, the UK. The UK seems to have way more Muslims, and they have this giant grooming gang sexual abuse scandal that seems to be massive, widespread, happening everywhere. And you know what? At some point, I'm going to have to do a video on that too, probably. Canada doesn't seem to be at that point yet. But there are isolated incidents that are beginning to crop up. And should things continue the same direction for the next 10, 20 years, those isolated incidents are probably going to end up looking like a pattern, and Canada will probably end up looking a lot like the UK. We are a decade or two behind the Brits on the Islamic immigration scale. However, all the pieces are already in place for things to get just as bad here as they are over there. You've got average people afraid to speak out lest they be branded a bigot. You've got the media running interference in the name of multiculturalism. And you've got Canadian Muslim populations isolating themselves into enclaves, and rather than integrating over time, becoming more radicalized over time. Sharia law considers Muslim girls to be noble, pure, moral, while non-Muslim girls are considered to be immodest, and the sexual playthings of Muslim men. This attitude, along with their outlook on gay people, trans people, and non-Muslims, ex-Muslims, and atheists, is baked into Sharia law. This doesn't mean that there can't be lax Muslims the same way that there are lax Christians, of course. But like I said, they're not integrating, they're radicalizing. And the UK is what Canada will be in 20 years if we don't tackle this problem now. No offense to any of you Brits out there, but the UK seems to lack the moral fortitude to tackle this problem head on and talk about it honestly. We can't make that same mistake. So no, local Antifa chapter, publish as many articles on me as you want. I won't shut up. And the reason I'm not shutting up is because, unlike you, I actually care about the human rights and the personal freedoms of those people living in Canada.